Welcome to Season 1 highlights of Data Matters. I started Data Matters at the end of 2024 with a simple idea: talk to data leaders from all over the world and hear about their problems. I'm delighted to say we've now spoken to 7 guests, and they've done just that. They've shared their problems, they've shared their insights, they've shared their challenges, and we've ended up with an amazing array of recordings. I really hope you enjoy it. Let's dive into Season 1. Starting with Jessica from Not on the High Street. Now, my recollection of the recording was that the time absolutely flew by. She described her journey from being dumped into the deep end, where there was no architecture, there was no plan, there was no documentation, and trying to navigate that and communicate what was important. Now, she came up with some quick wins. She came up with a couple of great techniques. The Wardley map stood out for me as just an amazing communication device. So good that we've started to use it, and I've recommended that our clients start to use it. So that little insight, I think, was more than worth recording the entire podcast. To see how people deal with chaos is really helpful to our community. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did.
Yeah, so Wardley mapping I kind of came across by accident. Before that, so I was tasked with I need to put together a data strategy. So I'd been looking into a number of things. I did a lot of research. There's a lot of from different consulting firms, this is what your data strategy should have, and it's really long and intense, and no one's going to read 50 pages of data strategy. And so it's a lot of buzzwords and keywords that are meaningless to anybody who doesn't understand them. So it needs to be for me, I want things to be simple. I want it to be easy for me to understand, because I don't have a typical data background. I've only been working in data for the past 5 years. So it was important to me that it was something that I could understand. I have a mentor, and she pointed me towards data maturity analysis. So I looked into that, and it started to make a little bit more sense. But forum I'm a part of, somebody posted a link to a video with Simon Wardley, who's the inventor of Wardley Maps. He was doing a talk, I think it was at CCOM, explaining the whole concept of a Wardley map. And it was at that point I was like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. So he was talking about Wardley Maps and how it helped him drive the strategy for his technology company at the time. He goes through the whole background of how he read a lot of books about war and the strategy within war, and how maps are used more in how you kind of develop your strategy, and which approach you're going to take.
Yeah, very
exactly.
The concept applies actually.
So yeah, it was I was just like, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. And he had a very good example of how he applied it to his photo upload business, and where they could kind of see things. So the idea behind a Wardley map is you basically focus on a specific user and their needs within the organization. And all of those needs have their own needs, and it kind of starts to cascade down, and you eventually get to the point where you have a complete picture of a particular process or a particular service. And the way a Wardley map works is you kind of put your user at the top of it, and then you've got all their needs, and then you can start to map their needs on the Wardley map. So top to bottom is however close it is to the user, it's more visible to them. They probably care a little bit more about it. The further away from the user, the less they would care about it, or the less visible it is to them. So data, for example, users use Looker reports or Tableau reports on a daily basis. So that's very visible to them. So your Tableau and Looker would be quite near to the top. Whereas your data warehouses, Snowflake, BigQuery, whatever you're using, they don't care. They maybe hear you say Snowflake once in a while, and they don't as long as where's my graph? That's what I care about. I don't really care where it's coming from. Just make the graph visible. So the less kind of visible, the less things people care about, those kind of at the bottom. And then when you're looking from left to right on a Wardley map, that's kind of how evolved particular components in your map would be. So on the left, be things that are very new, you're still exploring them and aren't well-developed ideas. And then as you move more to the right, it's kind of things that are well-developed, commoditized solutions, things you can just buy off the shelf. You're never going to create your own data warehouse nowadays. It's done. You're not going to create your own BI tool necessarily. You just buy one off the shelf. So those kind of things sit on the very far right. And then in between is kind of things that you're developing in-house, there's still ideas, you're still working on them, going towards this is quite established, we don't do much maintenance on it, but it's still something we're responsible for
Yeah,
in-house.
yeah. Do you
And
show that to people? Do you then take that to meetings and to explain to leadership this is what our architecture
yeah.
looks like, and do they understand it when you show it? If you do.
So it was this year that I created it because I wanted to create it as part of our data strategy, and was a great motivator for me to be able to show why I wanted to do some more like tech orientated projects rather than business impacting projects. So they do impact the business, and I was able to show how.
In episode 2, Joe and I had the opportunity to discuss the Matatika implementation at City Sprint and why it was necessary. City Sprint started out with this problem where there was an organization losing trust in their data, and that had occurred over time. Almost changes too small to see. They had introduced new technologies, they had some technology debt, they had this chaos of where all the data was coming from, and no single source of truth. So the plan was to fix that and get back to a gold standard of data. And Joe and I discussed some of the challenges, the organizational challenges, the technology challenges, and this is a project. All the while you have to run the business and keep things going. So I really hope you enjoy these highlights where we discuss some of those real problems that people face. And if you're in the middle of a big migration, perhaps these can help you.
But I call it a house of cards of a data platform, because we've had, as you can imagine, and I'm sure this is the same for a lot of people. People come and go; they all have their own way of doing things. So what we've ended up with is a sort of a sedimentary BI stack where there's some logic, and then someone's added a bit of logic on top, and so on and so forth. And over time, that becomes quite complicated to manage. So the opportunity that was spotted with working with you guys was to take all of that history, all that legacy, actually work out what's really relevant for the business today, because a lot of it is just noise that's accumulated over time, and to create a much more streamlined BI stack with just the logic that's relevant in as few steps as possible to deliver what the business needs today. But on top of that, to build in the maturity around that stack that prevents us sort of having the same problem build up again in the future.
Yeah. And I think probably, another common problem that I guess people are dealing with, certainly in a similar situation to ours, this legacy infrastructure, this legacy stack is working to some extent from the outside world. So the management team, the operations teams, they ask you for data and they ask you to do some analysis, and they get an answer. So from their point of view, it's kind of working. Whereas, the reality on the other side, for you and your team, it's hard, like it's really difficult, and it's becoming increasingly difficult was part of what we observed when we started the project. So I think, one of the things I saw us doing for the business was bringing a kind of, obviously, infrastructure cleanup, kind of a better system to work on, and therefore, people free up their time. They then become more effective. From your point of view, how do you go about communicating the benefits of that to the business? Because from their point of view, it was working, and then there's this project to make it better. So how do they see the benefits? Or how do you think they might see the benefits in a project of this scale?
You have to find something, a tangible benefit that they can latch onto, is my experience. So just rebuilding the platform with the same outputs is a tough sell, because it might make my life easier, but that's not the aim of my job, to make my life easier. And it is so long as it supports the business, but just for the sake of it, it's not. So to get buy-in from stakeholders in the business, they have to have a tangible benefit. And for us, one of the tangible benefits was moving towards one version of the truth. So one of the challenges that we've always struggled with in BI is being able to deliver a set of numbers that is always the same, no matter which report you look at it in. And because there's all these legacy logic in the stack, it tends to generate forks in that data where there's one view written for one set of people and a slightly different view with slightly different requirements written for another set, and then all of a sudden they're looking at reports and when they compare they don't match, So it's a story as old as data time, isn't it?
In episode 3, Stephen Burwash and I discussed some of the technologies that go into the heart of Matty. This story that Stephen tells is a great example of technology collaboration and the open source community coming together to discuss challenges and problems and come up with solutions. Absolutely awesome experience to be able to discuss these types of issues on our podcast.
So when you get started, well, as I said, I got started alone in my own team with a manager who was incredibly supportive, but he had no experience in the modern data stack, in the modern data space. So I was on my own. And so where do you find that support? Where do you find help? Like, my answer is everywhere. Like, there is no single solution. There is no, that is the Reddit thread you have to be following and you'll get all the answers from there. I was scrounging for information. So we met on the Meltano Slack, which was just the Slack of an open source tool that I still use to this day. Which
That's great, isn't it? The Slack group's great. The tool is great. The support there is great. Like, if you need someone else to speak to, like, they probably know how to solve it.
You get emotional and technological support. But the Meltano Slack actually bred, well, we should be on other Slacks. We should be on the DBT Slack, the Airflow Slack. But not only Slacks, Reddit. I went on the data engineering Reddit a lot, asking questions, read a lot of books, went a lot to meetup events in person. We actually were so inspired by meetup events that we actually started our own meetup events. So we're now in charge of the PyData Montreal and the MLOps Montreal meetups. The one piece of advice I would give to anybody that is just lost as I was and still am to this day in the data space is ask questions. A lot of people are scared of asking questions on the DBT Slack or anywhere. They feel like they'll be judged. They feel like their question is stupid. And I feel very strongly about this because everybody else within that space was exactly where you are now, which is you have no idea what is going on. And the beauty about it is there's so many tools out there and there's so many methodologies that you are constantly put back in that position of having no clue. And everybody has been in that position, which makes, in my mind, everybody incredibly generous with their knowledge.
I do find that. I think the community culture is very strong. I was going to say at the moment, but I do feel that you can ask questions. You don't get called out for being stupid or not knowing, because everyone was there. Everyone didn't know one time, and maybe a little bit more so in the open source world, in the kind of new tools world, because basically everyone remembers that because it was just the other day. It's all new. That's cool. A huge thank you to Bethany Lyons, who joined us on episode 4. Now, Bethany is a long-time product manager in a large visualization company, and turned to data consultancy and working at the coalface with real data. The idea in the beginning was that we would almost have a technology roast of Matatika and is it any good? And she's knowledgeable in the industry, and I looked forward to that, but also was a little bit apprehensive. The end result was much better than I could have imagined. One of my key takeaways from the discussion with Bethany is her focus on pragmatic solutions and getting the job done. And a lot of times that is the most important thing for a business, especially in analytics. You don't need perfect. What you need is enough to make a good decision. I hope you enjoy these highlights as much as I enjoyed recording them.
There's a pragmatic side of things as well. Like, it's nice to be like, oh, in the ideal world, you would have this as an input field in your system. And it's like, it's an expensive IT project and a huge change management transformation. And that's kind of the way I almost see data as like shadow IT in a way. Because there's so much you can fix with broken IT systems in a kind of, not an ideal way, but like in a good enough way. by just hacking together data behind the scenes from multiple systems. So I actually was like speaking to the head of Treasury yesterday, and I was like, today you're shadow IT building all these access databases. Like, let us as the central data team be your shadow IT department, so you be the business. We'll be the shadow IT team, and then the IT team can be the IT team.
You know, that resonates with me so much. I think the one place my mind goes to when you work on transaction record keeping systems, you often completely forget about the downstream reporting, and you're even a product manager of a data processing system. You think your job is to move an item through its life cycle, but your job doesn't end there. It has to be the reporting output as well. So the kind of shadow IT nature is that the poor old data team is coming along afterwards and trying to collect together what happened and the information they need. And you know, that's just repeated over and over because people don't think about the end.
They don't think about it at all. Yeah. And this happens like when I was in hotel tech, we built a property management system and I worked on the reports. And it was always like just fighting fires because feature teams would want to do stuff like enable you to uncancel a reservation. And I'm like, oh my God, don't implement that. You will break my pickup report. Like, it will be nonsensical.
Yeah.
And you have to like anticipate every possible eventuality. It's bonkers.
In episode 5, Adam reframed data quality as a company-wide challenge. And he took what was fragmented systems and data silos and, you know, applied his experience of getting teams to work together and teams to care about the data. His work broke down data silos, got teams working together, and created a trusted source of data through that collaboration. Adam reminded us that data quality isn't just a data team problem. It's a shared responsibility. Let's dive in and hear what Adam has to say about data quality. A way of talking about it, because a lot of people talk about it as a data quality issue, but actually it's more like a data team to rest of company interface issue. Like, you know, if people don't even know that downstream there's a data team to worry about, of course the quality's going to be, it's going to have surface, but that's not exactly where it starts.
Yeah. I think that this is a lot to do with the company's internal ways of working rather than necessarily like a data quality problem. Data quality now makes it sound like it's the data team's responsibility. And there is a responsibility to make sure that the data is good quality. But it's not specifically a data problem. It's a company problem that surfaces via the data. And it's just usually lack of alignment. And I do think generally, in lots of the places that I've worked in, data quality is an issue. And I've seen different levels of investment in trying to support it, trying to correct it. But quality is something that I think in most teams that I've seen, they could be doing more to monitor the quality of what they're producing. Also think that SQL itself doesn't lend itself well naturally to things like unit tests. There's certain best practices that would be there if you were from more of a development background, a software engineering background. And it's taken a little while for it to start to migrate down into more of the analytics world.
Yeah, exactly. It tends to be, characterizing a little bit, it tends to be that the data team is expected to follow fast and just sort of put up with what they get. And, that is obviously really hard. That's a really hard place to be because either you're pressed for time or you've got no ability to change your inputs. So that definitely hampers what you can produce. That seems to be a data team's lot in the world. And like you said, actually calling it a data quality issue almost lands it in the data team, and that's kind of unhelpful in its own way.
Yeah.
In episode 6, Nick Bromley and I talked about transport data and some of the things that we'd explored over the last few years. Nick aims to tackle an issue that is quite surprising. Transport data that's nearly a century out of date. Point-in-time data that just bears no resemblance to what transport requires today. And yet we're still trying to make long-term and short-term planning decisions off that data.
Well, yes, I mean, but you see, we've had decades of this very problem and how we've solved it, because modelling and collection of transport data has been more of a science than guesswork, probably since the mid to late 1970s. A lot of modelling work in transport sector, so you can trace it back to sort of 70s and certainly the 80s. So it's not like we haven't had 40 years at this. It's just that we've been using lots of samples of data, and we've been trying to sort of work out what we're looking at, a bit like sort of feeling an elephant in a dark room. We sort of feel bits of it and then draw conclusions as to what sort of beast it is, and that's become a whole industry in itself. Is what data are we going to use here, and how reliable is it, and what's the modelling tool we're going to use here, and how reliable is it, and these have become accepted norms, both within the public sector, in transport planners, highway engineers, etc., but also the consultants who work for them. And that's not a bad thing. We had to do something, as I said, because of the guesswork we were doing almost since pre-war. But the world's again moved on. We've almost 50 years since a lot of this started to change, and now a big change coming again.
And I think, talking about what's coming, I think it's now, so at one time it was impossible to have the full picture or even process the full picture. Even if you had collected it, it would have been impossible. With AI and the investment in big data processing technologies, cloud infrastructure, it is possible to process it. It is possible to have the complete picture. It might not be available yet. So we might not be collecting, sensing, might actually have gathered the full picture, but it is possible. Does that mean it's desirable? Like, do you think AI and this kind of mass processing, do we need the full picture, or is it kind of good enough to just stick with and we're making an analysis, we're making an informed decision, we're making a good enough decision? Do we need to have the full picture?
Well, of course, that's a sort of catch-22. I mean, basically, you need to re-benchmark the data we already have out there by building a new model with a new set of data, and then you can see how wide of the mark you are currently. It might turn out that certainly some parts of the network are pretty much optimized, but you might find there are some real disparities. But I'd also say you don't need to keep doing this. This isn't sort of a dashboard that you sort of sit there like some godlike being and on a daily basis reconfigure all the connections within the network and all the devices running over it, all the modes. I think it's a sort of a one-time, and then you let it settle down for another 5-10 years. Well, frankly, the public purse can't afford to keep re-engineering, certainly the railways. But the bus networks, there is quite a lot of flexibility and capacity that you could be retweaking fairly frequently.
In episode 7, Murtaza and I discuss AI in depth. Now, Murtaza is building an AI platform in a regulated banking environment. Now, there are unique challenges to that environment. There's regulators, and there's a need for guardrails and data quality systems that aren't perhaps necessary in simple product recommendations that aren't regulated. I really enjoyed this discussion. Murtaza had the opportunity to share his experience from previous roles, but also their experience of what they're building now. Brilliant episode. Really great to get to know Murtaza and talk about the challenges that he faces.
Yes, initially there were internal use cases where we created multiple AI assistant or AI bots with vertical knowledge stores, and then some ability to generate some content if they wish to. But then it did go to the customer. So initial use cases were indirect to the customer. So the internal employees were engaging with these bots and then having a human touch with the customer. And then we started looking at exposing these interactions directly with the customer. That took a while because we wanted to make sure it's has the right guardrails. It's matured enough. The conversations are right. There's lots and lots of testing you need because every time a response would be different potentially. We also had to look at, how do we actually store the conversation history, because the conversation could get quite longer, right? And those conversation history then could cost you a lot of money just to have one conversation due to the token limits. So those did happen, but we had to go through a mature cycle to understand this use case will work. It doesn't hallucinate. It has the right guardrails before we actually went into production. And we did go into production through for some of the social media channels like WhatsApp, Facebook, and Instagram.
I also found that testing and the guardrails a challenging aspect because it's actually quite counterintuitive to any kind of normal testing. You very much expect an input to generate an output and to test that. Whereas, with Gen AI, you can have an input and an output, and then you test again, same input, different output. And that's just, a concept that's quite hard initially to get your head around, well, how to deal with it, but also why that might be the case. And, same with the guardrails, you kind of don't really know initially how to test it and how to go about making sure that it's doing the right thing. And what did you do in that regard? Did you do it all internally through your own research teams? Did you bring in externals? These were the early days where no one really knew. So how did you overcome those challenges?
It was mainly through internal research teams. We did engage, one external research organization, but most of the engineering, actually pretty much 100% of the engineering, we looked at internal. And you're absolutely right. It's fairly new, right?
It's fascinating to see how Gen AI is growing and the hype around it. And one of the things I kind of often wonder, have we reached the peak already? Are we starting to see all the use cases we will see? What's your opinion? Are there more things it can do in financial services or in the wider world that we haven't even dreamt of yet?
I wouldn't say we've reached the peak as of yet.
Well, that's a wrap. Season 1 exceeded my expectations. Many more visitors, many more views than I had imagined. So thank you everyone for watching and being part of our journey. Discussing these different challenges of data leaders was the point. And I'm delighted to say that season 2 is now underway. We're recording right now. And there'll be more of that. There'll be more conversations with data leaders just like you who are experiencing challenges, solving problems with people, technology, processes. This is all part of what goes into making a data team work or not and deliver that value to companies. Season 2 guests, we have leaders from AWS, we have leaders talking about quantum computing. This is one of the special things about Data Matters, I think, is that we're exploring topics around data. And for me personally, it's a fabulous chance to get to discuss and hear about topics that I wouldn't otherwise have an opportunity to. So looking forward to season 2. Very much appreciate your support. Click subscribe so you can see each new episode of series 2 when it drops. Thanks very much.